So I'm gonna start again. Hello, good evening, and welcome to everybody, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to our next of our series of talks from the English Catholic History Association. This evening's speaker is Professor Mark Stoyle of Southampton University. And the talk he's doing this evening is on the Prayerbook Rebellion of 1549. So this is in our series of talks. We have many more lined up for the future, well into next year. We have excellent speakers, and Professor Stoyle is going to be talking to us shortly. So I'll introduce you to something about him. Mark Stoyle is Professor of Early Modern History at the University of Southampton, an expert on Tudor and Stuart Britain. He's the author of 7 books, including Soldiers and Strangers and the Black Legend of Prince Rupert's Dog. And this book here, which I've got in my hands, A Murderous Midsummer, Western Rising of 1549, which Michael Wood has said is a riveting tale. And it certainly is. It's a fascinating story of the Prayerbook Rebellion of 1549, which saw the people of Devon and Cornwall rise up against the Crown. The Western Rising of 1549 was the most catastrophic event to occur in Devon and Cornwall between the Black Death and the Civil War. Beginning as an argument between 2 men and their vicar, the rebellion led to a siege of Exeter, savage battles with Crown forces, and the deaths of 4,000 local men and women. It represents the most determined attempt by ordinary English people to halt the religious formation of the Tudor period. So that's just kind of by way of introduction. And if anybody's interested, I've written a little piece in Banbury Historical Society's journal on the Oxfordshire Rising of the same year as well. So, Professor Stoyle, very welcome this evening.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thanks for those kind words of introduction. Hope everyone can hear me okay. Yes?
Yep, I think so.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining. As Tim said, I'm sort of based at the University of Southampton, and my subject today is the Western Rising, the bloody insurrection which began in Devon in June 1849 and which is nowadays usually known as the Prayerbook Rebellion. Now, I should confess to all of you straight away that this is an episode which has always fascinated me, because I myself grew up in mid-Devon, where so much of the action took place, and I spent part of my teenage years in Exeter, the city which the rebels besieged in vain during that turbulent summer. And indeed, I often feel that the Western Rising has followed me around for most of my life. I went to primary school in a local village where Professor Joyce Ewings, who was one of the greatest authorities on the Rising, then lived. And I went to secondary school in Crediton, the town where the first skirmish of the rebellion took place. And then, after I'd left school and got my first job, which was as an archaeologist, I worked on a sector of Exeter's city walls, which had been strengthened by the desperate defenders in 1549. And ever since I first became a professional historian, I've been scouring the archives for new evidence about the Rising, which, as Professor Ewings herself once observed, is one of the most poorly documented of the Tudor age. So the Western Rebellion is a perennial obsession of mine, and in my talk today, I'd like to draw on some of the material which I've discovered during my own research, as well as on some more familiar sources, in order to explain not only what happened, but also what the Rising was all about. And my talk this evening is going to be divided up into 5 parts. I hope this next slide will show that. No, it won't. Hang on a sec. I'm just looking to see if I can move on the slides. Let me see. No? Ah, yes, here we go. This is it. Sorry, bear with me. So in the first part, I'll sketch out the background to the Rising. In the second, I'm going to explore how trouble first broke out in the Devon village of Sampford, Courtenay in June 1549. In the third, I'm going to discuss the events of July, the month which saw the rebellion reaching its height, while in Fourth, I'll investigate the defeat of the insurgents at the hands of the King's army in August. And finally, I'll say a few words about the consequences of the rising and come to some overall conclusions. So that's my plan for the next 40 minutes or so. And let me begin with my first subject, which is the background. So, as almost all historians agree, the rebellion was primarily the result of conservative opposition to the English Reformation, the series of revolutionary religious changes which had recently been imposed upon the English people. Resentment had been building up across the kingdom ever since the 1530s, when Henry VIII, whom we see in this next slide, furious, of course, at the Pope's refusal to grant him a divorce from his loyal first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had made the decision to break with the Catholic Church and to establish a new form of worship. Ripples of dissatisfaction and unrest surfaced. The crown dissolved the monarchies and seized their wealth. And by the time that Henry died in 1547 and was succeeded by his son, Edward VI, whom you see in this next slide, religious discontent was rife. Edward was just 9 years old, and with a child on the throne, government lay in the hands of the king's councillors. This state of affairs caused great unease amongst religious traditionalists, who feared that powerful men were forcing the new faith of Protestantism upon the young king. But in fact, Edward himself was strongly attracted to that faith, and within 6 months, he and his protector, this was Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who you see here, the man who was really, in effect, ruler of England, issued a new set of orders for religious reform. These orders were intended to sweep away all sorts of traditional practices which Protestants considered to be popish, and thus to move the English Church much further continental style Protestantism. Now, violent opposition to Edward's religious policies had already erupted in the far west of Cornwall in 1548, when the Archdeacon of Cornwall's deputy, William Body, had been murdered at Helston by an angry crowd, and some 3,000 men had subsequently gathered in arms before being dispersed by the local gentry. Now, this is a map of Cornwall at this time. It doesn't actually show Helston, but for those of you who know the area, it's a little town on the coast, a little bit to the south of Hale, that you can see in this map. Now, there's no time for me to look at this particular incident in depth today, but it's worth noting that while the Helston disturbance was primarily the result of deep-seated religious conservatism, it may also have had an ethnic dimension. The village in which the rebellion of 1548 began, which was St Kevin in the Lizard Peninsula, and this is a picture of St Kevin today, it lay in a district which was still almost entirely Cornish-speaking at this time. And we shouldn't forget that the Celtic inhabitants of West Cornwall regarded themselves as an entirely separate people from the Saxon English during the Tudor period. And the fact that West Cornwall was Cornish-speaking can only have made its inhabitants even more stubbornly resistant than were other West Country folk to the message of the Reformation, preached as that message invariably was in English. While the fact that some of the West Cornish regarded themselves as a downtrodden and subject people meant that it was easy for William Body to be seen as an alien oppressor here, in a way that simply wouldn't have been possible elsewhere. Now, this Cornish commotion of 1548, as the revolt was known to local people, was swiftly quelled. But next year, fresh protests were sparked off in the West Country when Edward's regime introduced a new Book of Common Prayer, which, as you can see from this next slide, was printed in English rather than in Latin, as had always been the case before. And as I'd like to show in the second part of my talk tonight, these protests began in the little village of Sampford, Courtenay, which lies in the deep Devonshire countryside on the northern fringes of Dartmoor. Now, it's vital for me to pause and stress at this point that virtually everything we know about the initial disturbances at Sampford comes from the pen of John Hooker, an Exeter man and a stout Protestant who was then in his early 20s. Hooker watched the Western Rebellion develop from his vantage point in Exeter, and he later helped to defend the city against the insurgents. He was an eyewitness to the rebellion then, And it's clear that, like so many people who've lived through violent conflicts, he was to be deeply affected by that experience. Throughout the rest of his long life, Hooker would constantly revisit the events of that extraordinary summer, thinking about them, talking about them, and eventually writing a whole series of different accounts of the revolt, accounts which remain to this very day the chief primary sources on which all subsequent histories of the rebellion have been based. And Hooker tells us the trouble at Sampford began on the 10th of June, 1549, as the local priest was preparing to say the service in the church there according to the new book. This is Sampford Courtenay Church today, and it was just outside this church at this point that, according to Hooker, some of the parishioners, namely one William Underhill, a tailor, and others, went up to the priest and did demand what he meant to do and what service he would say. When the priest replied that he was preparing to say the new service, as he'd been ordered to do by the government, Underhill and his companions replied that he should not do so, saying further that they would keep the old religion as their forefathers before them had done, until eventually the priest yielded to their wills and said Mass as in times past accustomed. News of what had happened quickly spread, and it wasn't long before a group of gentlemen, having been told of what had been done in the church at Sampford and how the common people were assembled there together, rode into the village with the intention of calming things down. The gentlemen now held a parley with the protesters in a field beside the churchyard, but when the demonstrators refused to go home, the gentlemen, in Hooker's contemptuous words, did in the end depart without anything done at all. In Hooker's view, the failure of the gentlemen to disperse the protesters by force was a fatal error, one which gave the protesters heart and allowed their demonstrations to spread. But there was one local gentleman, a man called William Hellions, who was not so faint-hearted. He heard that the protesters had gathered at the church house in Sampford, and he set off to remonstrate with them. Now, fortunately for us, the old church house still survives today. It's got a Victorian front, but it's a very old building. And as you can see from the picture, it's a two-storey building with a set of stone steps leading up from the village street to the main entrance, a stout wooden door which opens up into a long room on the upper floor. And it was into this room that Hellions now burst, scolding his neighbours and telling them to go home. Predictably enough, he did not meet with a friendly reception. On the contrary, tempers flared, heated words were exchanged, and as Hellions turned to leave, someone produced from the sort of the waistband of their trousers, I suppose, an implement known as a billhook or a billock. I'm sure that some of you will be familiar with this. It's like a curved implement, curved metal blade on a wooden handle or pole, and it's used today in hedging. But this man drew this implement out and promptly struck Hellions with it on the back of his head as he was turning to go. Hellions promptly collapsed onto the threshold of the door and then tumbled down the stone stairs into the street below, where he was hacked to pieces by an angry mob. Now, his blood is usually held to be the very first that was shed during the rebellion, but as I'm going to show tonight, it was by no means to be the last. In the days which followed, more and more people from the surrounding countryside came in to join the protesters, and a letter sent from the king's councillors in London shows that they had been informed that there was a multitude assembled at Sampford Courtenay and that the protesters had now fortified the village. More interestingly still, it shows that the protesters possessed a surprisingly sophisticated command structure. At one point in the letter, the councillors informed their local gentry supporters that we desire especially those 6 men which do present the protesters' grievances unto one special man in the steeple in that town, and the same man also may be apprehended and punished above all others for example's sake. Now, the precise meaning of this sentence is perhaps a bit obscure today, but the overall sense is clear. A group of 6 men were by now presenting the grievances of the ordinary people to a single overall leader who had taken up his station in the church tower at Courtenay, the church tower you see here in this image. Who the man in the steeple was, we may never know, But my own suspicion is that it was William Underhill, who was probably much less humble than Hooker's dismissive description of him suggests, and in fact we know belonged to a relatively prosperous local farming family. And at some point after the special man had established himself in the church tower, the protesters decided them to make their way to the market town of Crediton, which lies 10 miles closer to Exeter. We don't know their reasons for doing so, but it may well be that their numbers were by now so large that the little village of Sampford could no longer accommodate them. While it's also possible that they were planning to escalate their protest by occupying Exeter, which then as now was the seat of local government. This is certainly what the Crown's local gentry supporters feared, and on the 22nd of June, a band of loyalists led by Sir Peter and Sir Gawain Carew, who were both ardent Protestants, sallied out of Exeter and launched a violent attack on the demonstrators. According to Hooker, the Carews had originally intended to negotiate with the commoners, but finding them intransigent, they eventually resolved to storm the town instead, burning down some barns and possibly houses in the process. Now, Hooker states that the attackers suffered the loss of some and the hurt of many during this engagement. But John Fry, a Devon gentleman who took part in the skirmish, paints a very different picture. In a letter written to a friend in August, Fry observed that our first fight with the protesters was at Crediton, where were slain of the rebels about 10 men, and of our men, none at all. And Fry's words raise the possibility that the loyalists may have won a much more easy victory at Crediton than Hooker's narrative suggests. And this in turn raises the possibility that the Carews may have waded into an unnecessary fight and thus provoked the escalation of the disorder. Certainly, the Carews' victory proved a hollow one, for as they rode back to Exeter that night, panic was spreading across the entire county. In the wake of the burning of the barns, wild rumours began to circulate that the gentry were planning to burn the common people out of their homes, and many more flocked in to join the protesters. Soon, Devon's local gentry governors, who had gathered in Exeter to deal with the emergency, found themselves entirely surrounded as the protesters blocked off all of the roads to the east. And to make matters even worse from the Crown's point of view, the local gentlemen were bitterly divided amongst themselves. For while religious conservatives continued to view the commoners as protesters, with whom it was perfectly okay to negotiate, religious radicals now saw them as rebels and traitors who could only be dealt with by force. On the evening of the 23rd of June, a fierce quarrel took place in Exeter between the Protestant Carews and their more religiously conservative gentry colleagues. Unable to agree on how to proceed, the Devon gentlemen now went their separate ways. Most of them left Exeter on the following day, and many of these individuals promptly fell into the protesters' hands and were imprisoned. By this time, desperate pleas for help had been dispatched to London by those local gentlemen, including the Carews, who remained both willing and able to resist the rebels. And on the 25th of June, Lord Russell, who was the West Country's leading nobleman, whom you see here, he left the capital with a force of about 800 men, all that Protector Somerset could spare to deal with the disturbances in the west as he battled to suppress other similar risings in East Anglia, Oxfordshire, and elsewhere. It would take Russell time to get down to Stoyle, and even longer to prepare his forces for action. And in the meanwhile, Exeter, whose town governors had decided to resist the rebels, was left to stand almost alone. And as I've in the third part of my talk today, July 1549 saw the rebellion reaching its height. On the 2nd of July, the rebels advanced to the outskirts of Exeter and laid siege to the city. And this is a beautiful Tudor map of Exeter. And if you look at, I think it's the left-hand side as you'll be looking at it, you can see just on the corner of the picture, there's a little church. You might be able to make out the word St. David on the far left-hand side. And it was here that the rebels established their camp at St. David's Down, just to the north of Exeter, where St. David's Church stands today. And the discovery made by Professor Eamon Duffy that the inhabitants of Morbath, on the fringes of Exmoor, sent 5 young men to join the rebels soon after that camp had been established, and that the vicar of Morbarth made a formal record of the money and equipment which the parishioners had given to these young men at their going forth to St David's Downs camp, is without doubt one of the most revealing new pieces of evidence to have emerged about the rebellion in recent years. As Duffy notes, the fact that these items of expenditure were calmly noted down in the parish accounts underscores the fact that the Morbarth men, like their fellow protesters all over Devon, are most unlikely to have considered themselves to be rebels at all, but would probably have regarded themselves as loyal subjects and good Christian men who were defending the true Catholic faith against the newfangled machinations of the king's evil counsellors. And having established themselves at St David's Down, the rebels infiltrated the suburbs of Exeter, which, as you can see, were very extensive at this time, all of the houses just outside the city walls, and from here they began to fire upon the defenders out of every door and window. Over the following weeks, both sides strained every nerve to break their opponent's will. And amongst the most zealous of the city's defenders was a certain Bernard Duffield, who was an ardent Protestant. Duffield led a series of successful attacks against the rebels in the suburbs, but he was eventually restrained and imprisoned by the mayor, who felt that Duffield was exposing the city's bravest soldiers to excessive risk. And upon hearing of this, we're told by Hooker, Duffield's daughter, a young woman in her late teens called Frances, barged her way into the mayor's presence, where she waxed so warm that she not only used very unseemly speeches unto the mayor, but also, contrary to the modesty and shamefacedness which is required in a woman, and especially a young and unmarried one, ran most violently at the mayor and struck him in the face, clawing at his skin with her fingernails. And Frances's attack on the mayor nearly sparked a riot as wild rumours began to spread that she was a secret Catholic, that he had been injured, and that the city was about to be betrayed. But order was eventually restored. And it's worth me noting here that this is one of the very few fragments of evidence we have about the part that was played by women in the Western Rising. But it's hard to doubt that local women on either side of the religious divide were just as involved and committed as their fathers, brothers, and husbands were. And we know for certain, indeed, as you may well have heard in James Clark's recent talk, that a group of Exeter women had actually tried to prevent the dissolution of one of the city's monasteries in 1536, one of the only group of people in England who were brave enough to try and stand up to Henry VIII. We know too that there were many women in the rebel host which besieged Exeter in 1549 who had clearly come to assist their menfolk by performing all sorts of duties in the camp, and most importantly of all, by foraging for food and other supplies, which was vital in terms of keeping the rebel army going. And meanwhile, the flame of rebellion had spread to the neighbouring county of Cornwall, where the common people captured the great fortress of St Michael's Mount. Within days, Humphrey Arundel, the gentleman who now emerged as the leader of the Cornish rebels, found himself at the head of an army of 6,000 men. And having seized control of the whole of their own county, the Cornish men now moved swiftly to the aid of their fellow protesters in Devon. And in early July, they surged across the River Tamar and captured the town of Plymouth, though the castle there did continue to resist them. Leaving some forces behind them to contain the loyalists in the castle, the Cornish men next advanced to join the Devon rebels before Exeter. And as they did so, the king's councillors in London were considering a formal list of demands which the Cornish insurgents had sent up to them. Now, sadly, the original document is now lost, but the councillors' written response to it suggests that it had included the demand that the Cornish people should be provided with a prayer book in their own tongue. Now, several historians have observed the absence of this request for a Cornish liturgy from a second set of demands, which was drawn up by the rebels around Exeter on the 27th of July, suggests that the insurgents had eventually decided for going back to the old Latin instead. Yet the ghost of the original, much more radical demand of the Cornish protesters can still be plainly seen in this later document, which includes a giant statement. We will not receive the new service because it is but like a Christmas game, but we will have our old service of matins, mass and evensong in Latin as it was before. And so we, the Cornishmen, whereof certain of us understand no English, utterly refuse this new English. These words make it very clear, I think, that Cornish cultural defensiveness had helped to fuel the rising and that there were many Cornish speakers in the rebel host. Now, this set of demands, which was drawn up by the joint force of Devon and Cornish rebels on the 27th of July, has an interesting list of signatories, and you can see that list here. The writing's not that easy to read, but you may be able to pick out that the first name to appear on the list is that of Humphrey Arundel, who had clearly assumed overall command of the rebel host once the Cornishmen had joined the Devonians before Exeter. The second name on the list is that of John Berry, Devon gentleman, while the third is that of Thomas Underhill. These three men and two others were described a little bit further down the list as the chief captains of the rebels. And the fact that Underhill's first name is given here as Thomas rather than as William suggests that Hooker may have got the rebel leader's Christian name wrong. Whether or not this was so, Underhill's importance in the rebel host is made clear, not only by the prominent place which is given him in this list of signatories, but also by the fact that a loyalist noted at about the same time that while the rebel forces before Exeter were divided into a number of different groups, a great part of them continueth with their first captain called Underhill, a tailor of Sampford, Courtenay. I think they keep him still because they cannot find his match, the writer went on, adding sarcastically that Underhill was a captain who'd been well chosen by the devil at the first. And further evidence of the crucial role which was attributed to Underhill by the Crown's supporters emerged 2 weeks later, when the Privy Councillors in London urged the King's General, Lord Russell, to take special care for the apprehending of both Arundel and Underhill. And the very next day, Protector Somerset himself wrote to Russell, telling him that the King's own honour demanded that Arundel and Underhill should not escape due punishment. And here we're reminded of the earlier instruction that the one special man in the steeple at Sampford Courtenay should be punished above all others for example's sake. I think it's quite conceivable that it was Underhill who was being referred to on both of these occasions. So, as the rebel leaders assembled to sign this joint list of demands, their position seemed very strong and they were clearly brimming with confidence. They probably believed that they were on the point of taking Exeter and that with that great city in their hands, they would be able to march on to London to force the king to agree to their requests. But on the 28th of July, Lord Russell, who had by now managed to assemble a powerful royal army at Honiton, at last began his advance on Exeter. Over the following weeks, hundreds of rebels were killed in a series of brutal battles fought on the eastern side of the city, and on the 5th of August, the insurgents abandoned their camps before Exeter and fled. Early next day, Russell's troops finally relieved the city, and the 6th of August, the day of Exeter's deliverance, which was one which was to be celebrated by Protestants in for a further 300 years to come after this date. With the royal forces firmly back in control of the countryside around Exeter, the local people had no choice but to submit. Writing to a friend at this time, the loyalist gentleman, John Fry, reported that above 10,000 people have begged for their pardons to my Lord Russell, and he went on to add that there have been executed of the rebels already 16. And amongst these unfortunate figures was Robert Welsh, the vicar of St Thomas, the little church of St Thomas near Exeter. This church still survives today in the suburbs of the city. And Welsh had served as a rebel captain, and he was therefore hanged in chains from a gallows which had been erected on his own church tower. And several other local clergymen are known to have suffered the same fate at the same time. As they set about the cheerful task of stringing up the local rebel leaders, the king's commanders in Exeter probably thought that their enemies were finished. Yet, if so, they were, for the insurgents, showing huge courage, had regrouped again further to the west. In a letter written from Exeter on the 14th of August, Sir Gawain Carew informed a friend that while the most part of this shire is come in and receives their pardons, the inhabitants of the northern parts of Devon remain defiant. Not only this, rebel forces in West Devon were continuing to besiege Plymouth Castle, while most threateningly of all, Sir Gawain reported, Humphrey Arundel gathers his power still in Cornwall and determines to give us the battle. The Cornish rebel leader remained very strong, Sir Gawain went on, and he has a goodly band of men, I think to the number of 7,000 and upwards. Now, this was a highly impressive figure, especially as the rebels had already lost many men in the battles around Exeter. Nevertheless, Carew concluded, God holding his hand over us as he has done hitherto, we will be strong enough for him. Now, Sir Gawain may have been feeling confident, but when Lord Russell learned shortly afterwards that a strong force of rebels had reassembled at Sampford Courtenay, where they were fully bent to maintain their quarrel, he was filled with alarm. According to John, this news so troubled my Lord Russell that all business set apart, he commanded forthwith the trumpets to be sounded and the drums to be struck up, and all of his army forthwith to be mustered. Russell knew that he had to deal swiftly with this resurgent threat, and on the 16th of August, he ordered his forces, now some 8,000 strong, a vast army, to march westwards out of Exeter. And just before Russell sent out, John Fry wrote to a friend from Exeter to tell him what was going on. At this present, Fry observed, the people in all Devonshire be well in quiet, except the parts about Sampford Courtenay, where, as we be advertised, there be a great number of rebels, and the most of them Cornishmen. This present day we shall march forth out of Exeter towards Sampford Courtenay, Fry continued, and so from thence, if God wills it, into Cornwall, where I pray God will give us the like victory that he has given us heretofore. That night, Russell's troops quartered at Crediton, and next day they advanced upon Sampford Courtenay itself. After a hard fight, Russell's troops succeeded in beating one group of the rebels from the camp, which they had established on a hill outside the village. And as the insurgents fled, they were chased by the royal forces, which cut many of them down. In this pursuit, Russell later wrote, was slain 600 of the rebels, and amongst them one Underhill, who had had the charge of that camp. So clearly, Underhill had continued to lead the Sampford men till the very end, being cut down by the royal forces in the fields around his own house. And the fact that Russell went out of his way to record that Underhill had been killed hints at just how important he considered this particular rebel to be. That afternoon, Russell's army attacked the village itself and defeated the remaining rebel forces under Humphrey Arundel. A further 700 men were killed in the ensuing rout, with Russell's cavalry cutting down the rebels in droves as they fled along the moorland roads towards Cornwall. Only the onset of darkness ended this terrible slaughter. By the 20th of August, Russell's victorious army had crossed the Tamar, first capturing Humphrey Arundel and then imprisoning him here in Lawton Castle. And even before this, the insurgents had been driven out of Plymouth by loyalist forces, leaving 80 men behind as captives. On the 20th of August, Sir Hugh Powlett, one of the royal commanders, sent another letter to a friend, in which he triumphantly informed him that, I trust this business, in other words, the rebellion, now rests in a good stay. For the 8th conflict we have had with the rebels ended on Saturday last, in which bickering there were 2,000 traitors slain, while on our part there were not 40 persons killed. And Powlett's estimate of the relative casualty figures is supported by other sources and underlines just how many men the rebels had lost. Humphrey Arundel and all the chief rebels of Cornwall and Devon who are left alive are now in prison, Powlett went on, and the castle of the Mount is repossessed, so as I hope the weight of this rebellion is overpassed with such a scourge that the memorial of it will not be lightly forgotten. And the implication of these final words, of course, was that the slaughter of the insurgents had been so great that it would serve as a brutal object lesson to anyone who might be tempted to rebel in favour of the old faith again in the future. Even so, Powlett was forced to acknowledge that the local people showed themselves to be very ready to rise again in sundry places, being scarcely well pacified at this present in the north parts of Devon and the borders of Somerset joining the same. And this is a remarkable statement because it shows that despite the bloody slaughter of the past few weeks, the anger of the common people remained such that they were still looking for any possible opportunity to rebel. And Powlett was quite right to see North Devon and West Somerset as a continuing focus of resistance, because on the 24th of August, it was reported that a fresh band of rebels had risen up there and were making their way into Somersetshire. Eventually, a strong force of royal cavalry was sent after them. They ran this final group of insurgents to earth in West Somerset on the 27th of August, and in a swift battle, literally cut them to pieces. And with this defeat, the rebellion may at last be said to have come to an end. So what happened after the rebellion was over? This is the subject which I'd like to turn to in the final part of my talk tonight. Throughout Devon and Cornwall, loyalist gentlemen and soldiers, many of them mercenaries from the continent, now fanned out across the countryside like vengeful wolves, imprisoning, beating, and all too often simply executing those who had taken part in the insurrection. And indeed, as martial law was declared across the two counties, a veritable reign of terror ensued. And to illustrate this point tonight, I'd like to tell you just one story, a story which I recently uncovered while studying a badly damaged document at the National Archives in London. Now, after a great deal of time spent trying to decipher it, I discovered that it was in fact a petition for redress from a certain Thomas Ennis, a middle-aged man who lived in St Gluvius in the far west of Cornwall, and who had been apprehended in the wake of the rebellion by a loyalist called Stephen Plaisted and accused of helping the rebels. And having once got Ennis into his clutches, Plaisted had then demanded that he give him the enormous sum of £400. That's more like £500,000 in today's money. It would certainly be enough, even today, to buy yourself a very nice house. And he demanded this as a kind of on-the-spot penalty for Ennis's supposed offences. And when Ennis refused to pay this monstrous fine, Plaisted directed that his unfortunate victim should be bound about both his hands with a rope like this, and that then a rope should be twisted around his hands. And finally, a stick should then be inserted into the rope, and the rope tightened with the stick to such an extent, so tight that the blood actually spurted out at the end of poor Ennis's fingernails. And as you can see from this next image, this was actually a form of torture which was quite common in early modern Europe, and it was probably something that had been brought over by the foreign mercenaries serving in Somerset's army. So this was bad enough and painful enough, but not content with this, Plaisted subsequently ordered that ropes should be similarly bound and then tightened, first about Ennis's head, and then, and I'd sort of advise the gentlemen in the audience to sort of brace themselves at this point, tightened around his genitals with the same sort of appalling effects, afflicting him with the most intolerable pain. And not surprisingly, after having been subjected to this barbarous torment, Ennis eventually agreed to give Plaisted everything he possessed. So bad did the situation in the West Country eventually become that news of it reached the capital. And in September, the King's councillors wrote to Russell from there, ordering him to present his men from going to the spoil. Now, presumably Russell did what he could to see these orders obeyed, but if so, his instructions had little effect. 3 weeks later, the King's General himself was forced to write to the Cornish magistrates from Exeter, telling them that he had received many horrible complaints from Cornwall. The people there were being harshly treated, Russell explained, and the whole common folk universally vested with oppression. Anxious that this brutality might stir the Cornish into a new rebellion, Russell ordered that the due process of law should be restored at once. But by this time, it was almost certainly too late for the hundreds of ordinary people who had been plundered, pillaged, and abused. And even as the humble rebels suffered in their home villages, those of their leaders whom the government had managed to capture were being escorted back to the east. On the 8th of September, Humphrey Arundel and others were dragged into the capital and lodged in the Tower of London. Here they were tortured, interrogated, and in late November they were put on trial at Westminster Hall. Needless to say, this was a show trial rather than anything else, and no one can have been in the least bit surprised when sentence of death was passed on all four of the surviving rebel leaders. They were promptly condemned to be taken to the public gallows at Tyburn, and on that gallows, the sentence read, on that gallows suspended, and while yet alive, be cast down upon the ground, and the entrails of each of them to be taken out and burnt before their eyes while they are still living, and their bodies to be divided into 4 parts. On the 27th of January, 1550, Humphrey Arundel and 3 of the other rebel leaders were accordingly hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn. It was a bloody end to a bloody episode, a rising which had probably seen more people killed and wounded than had any other rebellion of the Tudor period. And not surprisingly, the commotion time of 1549, as the rebellion was popularly known, remained burnt into the memories of West Country folk ever afterwards. They had lived through a nightmare. It was one which would haunt their dreams for centuries to come. So why should we care about the Western Rising today? This is what I want to touch on in the last few minutes of my talk. It was an episode which lasted only 4 months from start to finish after all, and one which saw those who had sought to oppose the Edwardian Reformation being utterly smashed by the royal forces. The Protestant polemicist Nicholas Udall jeeringly dismissed the insurrection as a midsummer's game in a loyalist pamphlet, which he wrote in London at the height of the disturbances, and many other writers have been similarly scathing, both about the protesters and about their aims ever since. In John Hooker's view, for example, the country folk who had set off from Sampford, Courtenay in June 1549 had not only been posturing actors, taking part in what he termed a self-penned interlude or play, but had also been quite literally lunatics. For Hooker observed that the sun being in Cancer and the midsummer moon at its full, their minds were full of folly. For the modern historian A.L. Rouse, meanwhile, writing nearly 500 years later, the insurgents had been poor fools whose programme had been a pathetic manifesto of Catholic reaction, and whose blood had been spilt, Rouse wrote, in a vain attempt to turn back the tide of the history and to fight against the future. Yet, as this audience, I suspect, will be particularly aware, these were the opinions of writers who believed that it was England's manifest destiny to become a Protestant country, that England is bound to be C of E, as the authors of 1066 and all that once so memorably put it. And as our former conviction that Englishness and Protestantism are inextricably bound together has gradually begun to fade during the decades since 1945, so it's become increasingly easy for each of us to glimpse the possibility of roads not travelled and to see that the success of the English Reformation was by no means preordained. Once we've abandoned the assumption that those who sought to resist the top-down implementation of Protestantism in England were poor fools, vainly attempting to cling on to an outmoded set of spiritual and cultural values, once we've abandoned the enormous condescension of posterity, in other words, then it becomes so much easier for us to sympathise with their plight. We shouldn't forget that England underwent nothing less than a cultural revolution during the mid-1540s. Within months of the boy king's new government coming to power, the ruling elite had launched an unparalleled assault upon the customs and traditions of the great majority of their fellow countrymen and women. Almost overnight, beliefs which had hitherto seemed unremarkable, beliefs which had hitherto indeed enjoyed the official sanction of both church and state, had been outlawed. Almost overnight, a flood of scurrilous material had appeared in the public sphere, which had both mocked those who showed themselves reluctant to embrace the new fashions and had hinted at the dark fate which awaited them if they persisted in their obstinacy. And almost overnight, people across the entire kingdom had begun to feel that they were living in a new England, an England which was no longer merry, an England in which to voice what had been until very recently the most innocuous of opinions on a wide range of subjects was now to run the risk of being denounced to the authorities by one's neighbours. One does not have to be a Catholic oneself, I think, to sympathise with the hundreds of thousands of people who now found themselves in this desperately uncomfortable situation. Most of them did what most of us would probably have done in the same circumstances. They kept their heads down, they kept their innermost thoughts to themselves, and they hoped against hope that the storm would eventually pass. The inhabitants of Sampford Courtenay, by contrast, and the thousands of West Country folk who followed their lead, refused to be cowed. Instead, they stood up for what they believed in, and they fought for it with quite remarkable courage. And whether you yourselves are Catholics, Protestants, people of other faiths, or people of no faith at all, I hope that you will all agree with me when I say that for the sheer tenacity with which they raged against the dying of their own particular light, the Western rebels surely merit an honourable place in the pantheon of Tudor history. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent talk. I found it absolutely fascinating. I've got a great interest in 1549, which Professor Stoyle knows about from meeting somebody randomly and then doing some research on the Oxfordshire Rising. As we know, of course, riots are not something new and have always seemed to have happened every so often, and they're always in summer. I can't think why. You know, if you think back to some of the rebellions and riots have been in the past, you know, we've had the Peasants' Revolt, the Pilgrimage of Grace, the Northern Rising, and so on. And of course, the West Country Rising of 1549. And at the same time, there was a rising in East Anglia as well, Professor Stoyle, which was Kett's Rebellion as well, which was not necessarily connected, but was the same summer, wasn't it?
Yes. I mean, it's a very interesting point about the whole thing about Kett's Rebellion. You know, the Western Rising is so clearly a religious rising. That's at the absolute heart of it. Kett's Rebellion is very different. It's mainly about economic issues. They don't really say that much about religion. People often ask me, you know, why that was the case. I think there's a fairly simple answer, perhaps, that in the west of England at this time, West Country, Cornwall, Wales, Devon, those are probably the most religiously traditional areas of the country, the north of England as well, of course. Whereas in East Anglia, Protestantism is beginning to come in. There are actually quite a few Protestants in pockets, certainly in East Anglia by this time. So it would have been much harder to have got sort of a unified religious response there. So there are hints, and a number of writers like McCulloch and Duffy have hinted at this, that, you know, some of the leaders there were almost trying to play down religion, and particularly not make too much of conservative forms of religion, in order to almost make the government think, well, these people are just asking for relatively small economic changes, which we might be able to grant. You know, that's things we can budge on a little bit. But of course, there was no way the government was ever going to give in to the Western rebels. It was an absolute battle of extremes. Either the government won and put them down bloodily, as they did, or the Western rebels won, and that would have been the end of Protector Somerset and probably of Edward as well, I suspect.
So there seems to be a connection between the West Country Rising and what happened in the Midlands. Something of that seemed to spread. And from my research, agriculture, enclosure of land seemed to have been one of the factors, certainly in Oxfordshire, because their first action in Oxfordshire was near Tame, where they were said to have thrown down some sort of fencing or something around the park and disparked and basically killed the deer and so on. The deer park belonged to Lord Williams. But they also actually, interestingly, in my research, I found out that they didn't have much time for the Farmer family as well as Somerton, who I've written and published on before, and they were Catholics. But they'd been trying to enclose the land. So although they were Catholics, that didn't appear to be a factor. It's basically they were landowners and therefore they were enemy kind of thing. So that's certainly the Oxford. So was there much connection between the West Country and the Midlands?
Well, that's
rising?
a really interesting point, Tim, because it's almost, as you say, there's a kind of interesting blend of things going on in the Midlands. It seems to be, it's partly about enclosure, but it's also about religion. Obviously, the Oxfordshire Rising, partly led by priests, you know, they make a number of statements which make it clear that they're very religiously conservative. I mean, One of the
Yeah.
fascinating things I think about the West Country rebels is they've always been seen as sort of isolated and backward and sort of rustics who didn't have a sort of a bigger plan. But there was a great deal of sympathy for them elsewhere in the kingdom. Russell just couldn't raise troops in Somerset and Dorset to put them down. He was eventually, the only reason he was able to take them on was because he could deploy mercenary soldiers against them from the continent. That's really why he was able to defeat them so easily. And I think it would have been so easy for this rebellion to spread. There's a plan in Salisbury by local people to rise up to fall on Russell's back and join the Western rebels. I think there's no doubt the Oxfordshire rebels would have joined them if been put down first. I found some really interesting evidence about feelers being put out to the people of Wales, some of whom said they would meet the Western rebels on Salisbury Plain. So it's a much more dangerous rising than I think most historians have realised. And I think it's because there's a lot of writers in the past, at least, presume that most English people are always going to be Protestant. But of course, in 1549, the great majority of the English people are still Catholic, or at least very religiously conservative. Far more people sympathised, I think, with the Western rebels than with those who put them down.
I think there's a lot of evidence for that. I mean, it was part of the sort of risings against the Protestantization of the church, really, particularly under Edward VI. And a continuation, really. The Pilgrimage of Grace was connected because they had the West Country rebels had the Pilgrimage of Grace banners, didn't they?
Well, that's interesting, actually. We don't know that for sure. That was said by Francis Rose Troop, who wrote the famous book in 1912. I haven't found any contemporary evidence for that, but what we do know for sure is that the rebels were well aware of what happened in 1536. I mean, for anyone who's not familiar with the pilgrimage, in 1536 there was an enormous rebellion against Henry VIII in the north, or enormous protest, which was very much, as Tim has said, against the Protestantization of the church. Henry was cunning and shrewd enough to put that down by offering pardons and all sorts of concessions, and then striking like a tiger against the leaders and executing many of them. The Western rebels knew about this. They actually mentioned it. They knew what had happened in 1536. They were not going to let that happen to them. And I think that's one of the reasons they just keep resisting and resisting until the very end. I mean, again, one of the points I'd like to make is that it's almost unheard of for Tudor rebels to just keep fighting and fighting and fighting despite being defeated. It's usually one battle and they go home, or else it's not even a battle at all and the gentry persuade them to go home. The Western rebels are almost like the Terminator. They keep fighting till there's literally none of them left. They've all been killed or captured or dispersed. And I think that their courage is absolutely remarkable.
Perhaps that's a stubborn Cornish trait or something, or a West Country sort of attitude of resisting authority. I don't know really, but certainly they were very angry. I mean, of course, the Cornishmen have often resisted things that happened from London as well, haven't they?
I think it's because there's this mixture going on in 1549. The West Country folk are fighting, I would argue, for their religious faith. So obviously that's something that people are prepared to die for, much more than you might over enclosure say. And also, as you say, Tim, there is this particular question of identity. I think Cornwall has always been different and separate. It was very different and separate in the Tudor period. And the Cornish tend to see the Reformation as an attempt to impose Englishness on them. And that's another reason that they cling so firmly, I think, to the Catholic faith for as long as they can.
Interesting. I was pleased that you mentioned the role of women. And of course, there was the episode of the women resisting the destruction of a church in Exeter.
Yes.
During, I think, Henry VIII's time. But I think the role of women is often something we need to emphasize a lot. I certainly have mentioned it a number of times before, and I think it's so important that women were 50% of the population and equally must have shared the same views as the menfolk.
Definitely.
But often don't get the mention because we didn't actually get involved in the action.
There's a very good book actually on the 1569 rebellion in the north by Krista Kesselring. And obviously the evidence base for the 1560s is much better than it is for the 1540s and 1530s. We've just got so many more documents, so much more information. And it's interesting that Krista's work has shown lots of evidence of women in the north in 1569 supporting the rebels, talking in favour of them. Particularly interesting that they go into churches and burn Protestant Bibles, Protestant books, set up altars. So as you say, Tim, I think, women are very much assisting the rebels. They're not usually fighting on the battlefield, but they're doing all sorts of other things as well to help them. And I do think that's been really neglected. I meant to say, actually, I got a final slide to share with you all. So These are just some extra things where you can find more information if you'd like. I'll go back to that in a moment. But I also wanted to show you this slide. There's actually a play being put on in Exeter in October, which is called The Commotion Time. It's written by Sarah Dickinson, and I've been kind of collaborating with Sarah on this. And that's very much doing what you said, Tim. It's sort of playing up, the female dimension, all of this. And, obviously it's a fictional account, but it's trying to show some of the ways in which women almost certainly were involved. So, if any of you are interested in following up on the Western Rising, you happen to be in the West Country at that time, you go and have a look at the play. And I understand it may transfer to London in due course, so you might have other opportunities to see it.
Yes, I'd like to go and see that. Would be fantastic. I'm doing a talk on recusant women at Husbands Bosworth in Leicestershire on the 29th September, actually, heroines of the Reformation. If anybody's interested in Husbands Bosworth, Old Hall there. Anyway, in the box here, we've got one or two things from one or two people. So I'll tell you what they've said. Hayley, who I know Hayley. I was communicating with Hayley earlier today, I think, or yesterday. Dear Mark, thank you for a very interesting lecture, and your research is brilliant in including the use of landscape and culture. So that's great.
Thank you, Hayley.
Phil says, were there fewer recusants later on in Cornwall because of fear of reprisals?
Oh, now that's a really interesting question, actually, because what happens next after 1549 in the West Country is quite a sort of, it's a more complex story than you might think. So right through Henry VIII's reign, the early part of Edward's, Devon and Cornwall were probably the certainly two of the most religiously conservative counties in England. But the effect of this really savage suppression and huge numbers of killings seems to have been very different in the two counties. So in Devon, local Protestant gentlemen quickly begin to bring in lots of Protestant clergymen, and there's a real push for reformation. And I would say by the 1630s, Devon is one of the most Puritan counties in England. There's a complete change. It's almost as if what happens in 1549 kills that Devonian Catholic identity almost entirely, apart from in a few gentry households. But in Cornwall, the situation is almost completely the opposite. The Cornish are eventually forced to become Protestants, just as the Devonians are, but they do it in a completely different way. They become the most conservative Protestants they can possibly be, sort of clinging on to everything the Elizabethan Church allows them to cling on to in terms of sort of relics of Catholicism, if you like, and also going a good deal further than Elizabeth would have allowed as well. And so by contrast, on the eve of the Civil War, Cornwall is probably one of the least Puritan counties in England, while Devon is one of the most. And I've been puzzling over why this happens. I think it partly reflects this Cornish desire to keep a separate identity and to remain different from England. So if most of sort of southern England becomes more and more Protestant and sort of zealously Protestant and Puritan, the Cornish almost go the other way and stay as conservatively Anglican as they possibly can. And I think this helps to explain why in the English Civil War, just 100 years later, Devon is a very parliamentarian county, while Cornwall is the most royalist county in England. So very different patterns over the next 100 years in those two counties.
I note, I haven't visited lots of Cornish churches, but some Cornish churches I've visited seem to be very, what one might high church or Anglo-Catholic. Certainly at Tintagel, I was at Tintagel a couple of weeks ago, and that's very much the theme there. And many other Cornish churches I've visited often as well have sort of clung on to an older sort of faith, it seems, and almost a connection way back to sort of insular British Celtic times almost.
Exactly.
As well.
And that's exactly the way they kind of spin it. I mean, and it's the same in Wales, that again, Wales, at the time when Edward comes to the throne, Wales is essentially still a Catholic country. You might have expected there would be enormous trouble and strife when they try and impose Protestantism on Wales. But the way they do it is to sort of spin Protestantism to the Welsh in a different way. They give them a Welsh Bible, they give them a Welsh prayer book, they claim that the Protestant faith is not a new faith that's been imposed on the English, it's rather a recreation of that old Celtic faith that the Cornish and the Welsh had sort of preserved throughout the centuries. So there's a very clever job being done there by Elizabeth to kind of sell Protestantism to the Welsh. And it works really well because there are no great rebellions in Wales during the Tudor period. And just like Cornwall, Wales becomes Protestant, but extremely conservative kind of Protestant. And again, Wales, like Cornwall, is an absolute bulwark of royalism during the Civil War. So they're both areas where Puritanism just doesn't get a foothold before the interregnum.
Mm. As opposed to something like Banbury, which is near where I live, and which was very Puritan, and
Famously so.
even the Banbury crosses, there was more than one actually, got smashed by the Puritans because they said it was popish, and so, even in the 18th century. There aren't any Puritans left in Banbury, though. I haven't located any. But I think they all went off to America. Anyway, question from Haley. Sussex was very Catholic. A county I know a little bit. Some of my ancestors came from Sussex, actually. And the eastern part of Hampshire, both part of the cultural province of the Weald and Downland. I think Haley has an interest in Catholic recency in Hampshire and Sussex, I believe. So I don't know whether you know much about that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, again, I think these sort of, I've obviously been concentrating on these cultural patterns in the two western counties, but as Haley says, and as you've said as well, Tim, you can see these patterns sort of playing out all over the whole kingdom. I mean, essentially, I think what happens is that some areas Protestantize very quickly. I mean, Essex would be a great example. The most Puritan county in England becomes zealously Protestant really early on. Others do it very late, like Cornwall and the Welsh counties. And then in other places, like in Dorset, say, you've got a much more mixed pattern. There are some stoutly Puritan towns, like Dorchester is a great example. But then you can see also really conservative Anglican towns like Blandford Forum. And during the Civil War of the 1640s, these neighbouring communities are at daggers drawn because they've essentially developed in very different ways, religious and cultural terms. I think this is the problem with Elizabeth's religious settlement. In some ways, it's great because it prevents there being a civil war in the 16th century. It gives everyone a certain degree of latitude, and you could admire it for that in lots of ways. But it does mean that gradually England is beginning to pull apart into rapidly Protestantizing areas and areas that are just doggedly staying true to their old customs and faith. And so in that way, you could say that Elizabeth is really sort of storing up trouble for her Stuart successors. And I think you can see that the Civil War of the 1640s has really very long roots which stretch back to the Reformation in this way. These sort of divisions seem to have been healed, perhaps by Elizabeth, but really they haven't, and they're kind of festering and growing under the surface.
Yeah, they certainly did fester considerably under the reign of Elizabeth I. And interestingly, you said about it was different in different places. I mean, we mentioned Sussex, of course. Lewis became a hotbed of Protestantism, especially after the reign of Mary, because of the burdens of people at Lewis. And of course, they still have the bonfires every year. They no longer have the no popery banners anymore, as of about 2007, I think, because they were pretty much told get rid of them. But there's still, I mean, I went to Lewis, I was asked to go to Lewis as a speaker last year, the day before the bonfires, in a talk called No Popery, KNOW, and talked about recusant women and their role and so on. But there's still sort of strong feelings there, actually, for pro and for and against.
It was interesting, Tim. I had a student who comes from Lewis, and she told me that her dad was one of the people who go at the front of the procession with one of the big banners. But she also said they're a Catholic family, so he's a Catholic man taking part in these. It's very interesting.
I published an article on Guy Fawkes and the Lewis bonfires a couple of years ago, and but the people at the society assure people that they're no longer anti-Catholic. Although in the article I wrote, one of them was supposed to have said, "We're not anti-Catholic, we're just pro-Protestant." And as I pointed out, most people in Sussex today wouldn't have a faintest idea what a Protestant even was, let alone for and against. So it's all rather meaningless.
I mean,
at this stage in history.
I mentioned earlier the celebrations in Exeter. So, Exeter is unusual in the West Country in the 1540s. There's a small Protestant group there, so that's one of the reasons that they hold out against the rebels. And then later, Protestantism sort of takes off quite quickly in Exeter, as in many other places in Devon, and they really begin to celebrate this day when the siege was lifted, the 6th of August. It's originally called Jesus Day. It's just to celebrate the day itself. But over time, it becomes known as Jesuits' Day, and the rabble in Exeter rush about burning images of Jesuit priests and so forth. So it becomes a very anti-Catholic celebration over time.
Yes. I think there are a few Catholics who'd like to do that with one or two Jesuits today, actually, but we won't mention that. Yeah, no, Oxfordshire, it was an interesting patchwork, because North Oxfordshire, where I live, quite a lot of the population remained Catholic, and stayed so. Even in the 18th century or even early 19th century, half of them in some of the villages were still Catholic, with Catholic chapels around and so on. So Elizabeth didn't manage to stamp it out at all, but they weren't even persecuted. I found no evidence of persecution. If the landowners and the people kept their heads down and kept their mouths shut, they were generally left alone. So the idea that they were all persecuted everywhere is just nonsense. They weren't at all. Certainly not in this area anyway. Any more questions anybody's got anyway? Oh, hang on, we've got a question here from Laura. I'm wondering for how long the Cornish language reinforces not just political resistance, but religious conservatism. Were there pockets of Catholicism in Cornwall, or just the Anglican faith?
Oh, thanks very much, Laura. Again, that's a really interesting question, something I would have liked to discuss, because I think that in a Cornish context, the Western Rebellion is really important for Cornish history, because there is this tension that, the Cornish have been used to having their religious service in Latin. They would have their sermons and some of the prayers in Cornish, but essentially it's a kind of mainly Latin with a bit of Cornish thrown in. They seem to have been perfectly happy with that. Once the new prayer book is brought in, suddenly, Englishness is being forced down the throat of every Cornish man, woman, and child once a week at least in church. So it's a huge change, and I think that's one of the reasons there's to it. But there's a terrible sort of irony here that by rebelling against the state and appearing at least to have demanded a Cornish prayer book rather than an English one, they've almost tarnished their language with the sort of the stain of rebelliousness, and Cornishness with the stain of rebelliousness. And partly as a result of this rebellion, but for other reasons too, but partly as a result, they're never given a Cornish Bible or a Cornish prayer book. And that's the main reason, I think, or one of the main reasons why the Cornish language dies, relatively quickly after this, whereas the Welsh language is still healthy to this day. So it's a really bad episode in terms of, the history of the Cornish culture and language. I think it kind of, as I say, it makes the central government regard the Cornish with suspicion and refuse to sort of grant them anything that they might sort of ask for in terms of special treatment. They're just sort of forced to have all of these things in English. And whereas at the beginning of the Tudor period, Cornwall's divided roughly half and half into Cornish and English-speaking areas. By the beginning of the Civil War, it's only the far west of Cornwall that's Cornish-speaking. So it's quite a rapid change. And the defeat of the Cornish in the Civil War is almost like the last stand for traditional Cornishness. And again, after the Civil War, the sort of English intrusion into Cornwall becomes harder still, and religious changes become even more radical. And by 1720 or so, the language has almost disappeared. So this is a crucial milestone, really, in the history of the decline of Cornish. And I think that's one of the reasons that, Cornish people are so interested in the rising today. Does that answer your question, Laura? Have I covered all of the bits of that?
I'll see if there's any response there. No reply as yet, so I would assume so. Interestingly, for those who are interested, all the new MPs in Cornwall at the last general election, the current general election we just had, swore their oath in the House of Commons in Cornish. Although I'm not sure.
That was so interesting, Tim, because I must admit I've been interested in Cornish history for a very long time, and I mean you can see I've been doing this for a long time. When I started working in the 1990s on these sorts of things, so many English historians said to me, you're mad to work on Cornishness. It's a tiny subject. No one's interested in it. It doesn't matter. It's just something to disregard. It's almost a bit of a joke. Whereas now, as you say, everyone regards it with so much more seriousness and so much more earnestness. So there's been a huge turnaround in our attitudes towards Cornishness in the last 30 years, I would say.
There's Cornish musicians as well. There's a musician who's actually Welsh or half Welsh, half Cornish, and she sings in either Welsh or Cornish. I've forgotten her name
It's
offhand,
Courtenay.
That's the yes, that's the lady. Yes,
I've seen her.
Have you? Oh right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, and you've seen sort of on the internet sort of thing.
No, a
but
long
there's
time
some
ago.
other.
She was in a band a long time ago.
Oh right. Yeah. Well, there's another band as well who've recorded songs in Cornish as well. Again, I can't remember the name offhand, but it is a sort of revival in a way. And I noticed being in Cornwall, I mean, visiting Cornwall over many years, you do get signs in Cornish as well, and then you think, well, who's going to be able to read that? So certainly Tintagel, there's signs in Cornish, which, as I've got a working knowledge of Welsh, I can understand anyway because of the similarities with Welsh. But it's quite interesting that it's cropping up on signs, road signs, and tourist places and so on. Maybe it's a marketing ploy by the tourist board, or maybe it's
for Cornish is that because the Welsh language never went away, it's always been with us. Everybody knows how the words should be pronounced, how they should sound, all these sorts of things. Because Cornish actually did die in the 18th century, the different forms of Cornish that are spoken today, people have had to kind of guess what the words would sound like. And that means that the Cornish language speaking community is very fractured, and there are about 4 or 5 different brands of Cornish that different people adhere to very tenaciously. So it's a very complicated subject, Cornish language in Cornwall today.
Yes, well, it must have been based on dialects, and each dialect would have been different in its heyday, just like Welsh, because I've got relatives in North Wales, and one of them went to South Wales, and he said, I speak Welsh, but I couldn't understand what they were talking about.
Yeah, so, exactly.
Yeah. Interesting, right. Anyway, Laura says, thank you. Being from the US, I'm here to learn, which is, well, I suppose we all are, really. I think that's all the questions that's there, really. So I'd just like to say thank you very much, Professor Stoyle, for a fascinating and interesting talk this evening. For those who haven't heard of it, there's the book there. Professor Mark Stoyle, you can see it there, available on all websites, good bookshops, etc., etc., etc. Published by Yale University Press, I believe. So, and I certainly quoted from it in the article I wrote. It was very, very useful there, actually.
Oh, that's good to hear. I mean, I'd just like to finish by saying, well, thank you, Tim, for introducing me, and thank you, everyone, for having me. It's been a real pleasure to be able to talk to you all tonight.
Great, excellent. Well, it's been an honor to have you here. She, I think I pronounced that correctly, says thank you. And somebody else says, as Laura, I think, thank you very much, Professor Stoyle. Great talk. So I think we can say everybody's really enjoyed it. So thank you very much,
that's
everybody.
Great.
And next month we're having another speaker. We've got speakers lined up till the autumn next year. We're even having a link up with the Australian equivalent in September.
Wow.
I think it's on a Saturday morning, but we're having a joint talk with them, with the Australian equivalent of us as well. We're hoping to have a link with the Americans as well at one time, sometime, but nothing's actually come up. I've offered to do a talk for them, but we haven't yet got any links there. So if we have any Americans here who've got any influence with in that sort of quarter, then that would be great, because there are great links obviously between Britain and America, as we know, and there's lots of interesting areas of overlap, I'm sure, that we can explore. So thank you very much, Professor Stoyle, and everybody else for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
And I hope you've all enjoyed it. It's
Thanks
goodbye from me.